I'm here today with Paul Miller, author of a new book titled The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? Paul is professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and co-chair of the Global Politics and Security Concentration. He spent a decade in public service as director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff, an intelligence analyst for the CIA, and a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. Paul's writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Dispatch, Washington Post, Providence Magazine, Mirror Orthodoxy, Foreign Policy, and elsewhere. Paul taught at the University of Texas at Austin and the National Defense University and worked at the RAND Corporation prior to his arrival at Georgetown. He holds a PhD in international relations and a BA in government from Georgetown and a master in public policy from Harvard. He is a contributing editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And he's the author of several other books, including Just War and Ordered Liberty. You can learn more about Paul and all of his work at pauldavidmiller.com. So, Paul, welcome very much, and congratulations on all of your work.
Thanks so much, Brian. I appreciate you inviting me to be on the show.
Well, your book is incredibly timely, incredibly important, and so I was really looking forward to having this conversation with you. But before we get into that, is there anything else you'd like to tell people about yourself beyond what I kind of touched on there?
Sure. Listening to my professional bio is not one of my favorite things to do. I've heard it too often, and it just feels like it's talking about somebody else. I'm married. I got 3 kids. My kids are in the kind of middle school age range right now. Been living in Virginia outside of DC for a number of years. I'm a Christian. I go to a local Baptist church. And I love hiking and playing Minecraft with my son, among other things. There's a couple of just personal anecdotes that I'd love to share.
Cool. Well, just from a career standpoint, you've done some amazing things. I can imagine having a very lengthy conversation just to hear about what it was like in Afghanistan.
And I could talk your ear off about that. I'm actually working right now on a book about presidential decision-making in the war. Having worked 10 years on the war, I just feel like I got to get this book out. And Lord willing, a couple of years, maybe you and I will be back talking about that one.
Good. Well, that's good to know. I think, we only hear snippets, of little bits and pieces of what's going on, or what went on over there and many other instances like that. So to kind of hear it from someone who was on the ground for an extended period of time would really be, I think, helpful.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
So, but let's talk about some of the other books that you previously written, because you've got several.
I do. The previous books were academic works on international relations, which is kind of my bread and butter, or my day job, so to speak. My first one, based on my dissertation, is about armed state building. I was really asking the question, can't we ever do this right? We've done plenty of interventions before with armed force, and I wanted to know, could we actually do it right? So that was my dissertation, and then I revised it for my first book. And then my second book, I tried to broaden the aperture. I wrote a book about grand strategy. I wanted to kind of understand American foreign policy from the big picture, from the top down, so to speak, and put that out in 2016. And published it right as the debate about American foreign policy was really changing quite a bit, thanks to President Trump and his presidency. And so I had a chance to put that at a paperback version with a new preface that kind of addressed the Trump presidency and its changes. And then I published just a year ago a book on just war, which I felt kind of called to write as a Christian working in international relations. I had to address the rights and wrongs of war and peace. I just cannot think about these things without thinking about justice and right and wrong. And so the book on just war, I kind of read a couple thousand years worth of debate about when it's right and when it's wrong to go to war and why and what you're supposed to do with it, and condensed that into a book published by Cambridge University Press a year ago. So really, really proud of that work. And hope that it has a helpful effect on the debate about just war.
Yes. I think badly needed. It sounds like it's much needed beyond academia. I hope that it got traction in the trade world as well.
Well, I'm happy to share that I do have a contract for a book with B&H, I believe it's B&H, to do a kind of a layman's edition of that Just War book, because the last year's book was very academic, and it will find an audience with scholars and professors. But I think I recognize the need for a book that could be useful for pastors, chaplains, soldiers, and just kind of the generally educated, interested reader. And so I am working on that. Should be out here in a couple of years. Again, a more accessible version of that Just War book.
Good. Glad to hear that too. So let's get to the new book. As I said, the title is The Religion of American Greatness. What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? So how did that book come about?
Came about because in 2016, I looked around and realized that I no longer really understood a lot of what was going on in our country. I came of age on the right, politically, theologically, and was happy to call myself conservative in both senses and kind of politically and theologically. But I just didn't understand what was going on in those circles anymore. And I kind of cast about looking for why and for what was the new thing on the right that I didn't quite get. And in my reading, I found this word nationalism, and Trump embraced that label in October of 2018. And so I started to research what nationalism is, what it was, what it is around the world. I also read a lot more about American history, and I began to understand some pieces fell together, and I kind of saw the American story in a slightly different light. And that's where the book came from. So that's where the book came from. Just to clarify, I said that I characterized myself as a conservative. I still do, but I mean those words in the way they meant, the way they were defined kind of pre-2016. Much of the political right is, I think, no longer conservative. And so that's why I've kind of parted ways with what's going on there. But my own beliefs have not changed all that much. And so I'm writing about Christian nationalism as a Christian, as a patriot, and even as a conservative, although maybe I mean something different than what many people mean by that these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy world. You know, I think a lot of us, myself included, were just shocked by the 2016 election. Maybe we shouldn't have been, but certainly were. You know, I felt as though, you know, there were maybe 10% of the country that was, you know, quote unquote Christian nationalists, or, you know, whatever kind of characterization you want to call of this, what I consider to be a relative extreme group, but turned out to be a lot bigger than that.
I think that's fair. And by the way, I want to hasten to add that my book doesn't dwell a whole lot on 2016 or even on Donald Trump. I have one chapter in there about Donald Trump out of the 10 or 11 chapters in the book. I really try to take a broader look at Christian nationalism, sort of philosophically, ideologically, going much further back in American history before I eventually get to Trump. Your comment there, I think it's fair to say that Christian nationalism is more widespread than maybe we wanted to believe. Parasociologists, Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, they did a bunch of statistical data, and I think one of their numbers suggested that 3/4 of white evangelicals, by their measure, had pretty broad sympathies with Christian nationalism. Now, I can quibble about their methodology. I actually think that estimate's a bit high by how they measure, but it does give you a ballpark. I think that's probably somewhere in the ballpark of the number of white evangelicals who have sympathy with Christian nationalism. Of course, you and I know that's the major base of support for Donald Trump and for the Republican Party. So you could say that the primary electorate of the Republican Party is pretty strongly sympathetic, I think, to this ideology, even if, and this is a tricky part, even if many would not describe themselves in those terms. You know, the term itself, Christian nationalism, is relatively new in the mainstream. It's been around for a while, but new in the mainstream. And I think there's a lot of people on the right who maybe wouldn't embrace it. But as I look at the expressed beliefs, I actually do see quite a lot of Christian nationalism out there in the milieu.
Mm-hmm. Totally can see that. So who would you say the book is most intended for?
Well, it's intended for anybody who will read it. Although it is published by IVP Academic, I actually wrote it in the effort to get it beyond an academic audience. I think that this will probably find its way into seminaries. I really hope that future pastors read this. I hope present pastors read this. I suspect a lot of students at colleges will find it edifying. I do think that the, again, generally educated Christian reader should read the book. If you're in a church and you're and you're an American, and you're wondering about the relationship between your Christian faith and your American citizenship, read the book. This is for you. There's a lot in there that tries to pull threads together from American history, political theory, biblical theology, and present a picture of these two things, of our Christian identity and our American identity. But I hope I have made it accessible to the general reader.
In the book, do you get into much about separation between church and state, or is that too big of a topic that it needs to be handled separately?
No, I do address that. There is, by the way, an earlier draft of the book that was about 30% longer and had a much longer discussion of church and state. But that one ended up on the cutting room floor.
That's typical of any
That's right.
book, I think,
That's right.
in nonfiction.
So it's kind of implicit all throughout the book, this idea of the relationship between church and state. Now, as I said, I'm a Baptist, and the Baptist heritage particularly, a lot of Baptists don't know this, the Baptist heritage particularly was actually quite keen on emphasizing the different jurisdictions of church and state and the importance of keeping them separate, though I want to hasten to say the separation does not imply state-enforced secularism. A lot of Christians today are pretty nervous about this language of the separation of church and state because they think it means state-enforced secularism. And that's not what I mean, and that's not what the original Baptists meant when they advocated for it in the 18th century. What I want to do is recover that original sense that the church has its own jurisdiction, and we should jealously guard it from the encroachments of the state. And I'm really concerned that Christian nationalism blurs these things too much, and it's a bit dangerous because it can end up with the church effectively trying to outsource some of its jobs to the state, which is a really bad idea. We should never do that. We should never allow the state to take over our job representing the gospel of Jesus or being a display of God's glory. That is a unique prerogative of the church that we need to guard for ourselves.
So how is the book organized?
Well, I start off in chapter 1, just an overview of the book, and I also share my own story. It's a bit of an autobiography in there where I talk about where I'm coming from, why I wrote the book. In chapter 2, I define nationalism. I don't start with American nationalism or Christian nationalism, just looking at nationalism generally, and I distinguish it from patriotism. I'm a patriot. Patriotism is good. I think it's actually a Christian virtue to love and appreciate and be grateful for your country. Nationalism is actually not about loving your country. It's about how you define your country. It's an argument about the cultural identity of your nation, and it's a belief that the nation ought to safeguard the nation's identity. So it's a philosophy about the purpose of government. Chapter 3, I then give the stage over to advocates of Christian nationalism. People like Samuel Huntington, Yoram Hazony, Rusty Reno, even an Anglican named Nigel Bigger, Rich Lowry. And I just summarize their arguments in favor of Christian nationalism. And I'm very particular about doing that. I want to be as fair as I can to present their arguments in as strong a view as possible so that we have that. I'm not knocking down a straw man here. I'm actually engaging with the argument as they've actually made it. Then in chapter 4 and 5, I deliver my critique and I say, well, Christian nationalism, it's impractical. You can't draw cultural boundaries that way. They're blurry and they overlap. Therefore, nationalism is always intrinsically against liberty in some sense. It violates what I would call the doctrine of free culture. If we believe in free speech and free religion, we should also believe in free culture. And that is the exact opposite of nationalism that wants to enforce a nationally uniform cultural template. And I think it exacerbates our problems with identity politics and national divisiveness. Chapter 6, I then engage in theological arguments about nations in the Bible, the meaning of Israel, whether or not America should look to Israel as a template. I look at the chosen nation myth. America's not a chosen nation. And I talk about nationalism as a kind of a idolatrous false religion. When you really push it, I think at its logical extreme, it can become very idolatrous. And then in chapter 7, 8, and 9, I really look at the modern day. I look at the rise of the Christian right. I look at the political theory of the Christian right. And I argue that it is partly nationalist and partly small r Republican, civic republicanism, which I think is good, by the way. I think republicanism is a great thing. But the Christian right was always an uncomfortable mixture of these things. And so that's how in chapter 9, I finally talk about Donald Trump and why he was able so successfully to appeal to the Christian right, because the Christian right was, in fact, all along pretty nationalist in its orientation. And it led very naturally into Donald Trump's movement. And finally, in chapter 10, I conclude by saying, look, if nationalism is the wrong answer, what is the right answer? How do we have a sense of our commonality, our nationhood? What does it mean to be an American? And I answer that it has to do with a creed and with American history. And American history is our triumphs, but also our failings. And if we are to have any sense of what it means to be an American, we need to understand and acknowledge our national failings and our national triumphs, culminating in the national creed. And so there's the book.
Interesting. Wow. There's a lot of depth there, it sounds like, which is really good to hear. I mean, you clearly did a lot of research in a lot of different, areas that are important to this topic. So
I started the book 6 years ago.
wow.
And I want to hasten to add that because there's actually a lot of books about Christian nationalism out now. A lot of them came out right around the same time the last year. And that's not to criticize those other books, but I think maybe what might distinguish mine is that, I started thinking about it before it was cool. And I really did make an effort to give this book a depth, an even-handedness, a fairness that I think that the conversation deserves. I think it deserves something more than a hot take, something more than a kind of flash in the pan. So,
I mean, that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, with all of our politics and our media and everything, it's just like, sound bites that
That's right.
are not
That's right.
nuanced and not, oftentimes misleading. So,
Yep.
So I'd like to read a couple of the endorsements from the book. Here's one from Michael Ware. He says, "This is the nuanced, constructive approach to Christian nationalism that I have longed for, that takes this moment in our history seriously, condemns what needs to be condemned, but also offers a clear and viable vision of what Christian political participation should and could be. Paul Miller defines the problem and identifies bad actors and expressions, but he does this necessary work for a greater purpose, orienting our political vision toward the common good." So I'd like to unpack that a little bit, because he says a couple of important things there. First, he says you offer a clear and viable vision of what Christian political participation should and could be. So can you describe that vision for us?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I start to get into in chapter 10. If nationalism is the wrong answer, what is the right answer? I'm a Christian. I'm involved in politics. That's not Christian nationalism. I think all Christians should be involved in politics in the sense that we should love our neighbors and love them politically because we have the privilege of democratic citizenship, and we should vote for justice and the common good. And none of that is Christian nationalism. We should appreciate the best of our country, and that does include the American creed of liberty and equality for all. I think that we should protect and safeguard that experiment in free government. I think it's an incredibly fragile experiment that is under danger from threats from the illiberal left and illiberal right in our day and age. And so we should be involved, and we should seek to preserve and upkeep this experiment in free government. As I said, I do think that means cultivating an appreciation for American history, because I don't think the creed is quite enough to hold us together. I think it has to be the story of the creed as we have gradually lived up to our creed more and more over the centuries. We should appreciate the sacrifice people have made, the sins we have repented from and overcome, and the work that is yet to be done. That is what it means to be an American. It means to step into this story and say, yes, this is my story, warts and all, triumphs and all. This is my story, and I'm going to assume responsibility for living the next chapter in my day and age. That, I think, is what responsible Christian political participation looks like.
So another thing that Michael says is he does this necessary work for a greater purpose, orienting our political vision toward the common good. And personally, I view that our recent lack of prioritizing the common good is one of the serious and fundamental issues that we have right now. So how are you suggesting that we increase our focus on that?
Well, I try to draw a contrast in the book between Christian engagement that works for the common good and Christian nationalism, on the other hand. Christian nationalism is, as I say in the book, in some sense, it is identity politics for white evangelicals. It's special pleading for our tribe. It's attempting to preserve the social or cultural predominance that, of course, white Christians did in fact have for most of American history. Now, we're losing that predominance culturally and socially, but that's not intrinsically unjust. It's just simply a fact of cultural change. Cultures change all the time, all around the world. I think we have to understand that the loss of our social predominance is a fact, not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily an unjust thing, nor is it persecution for us to simply lose cultural predominance. Our political agenda ought to be more than protecting the privileges of our tribe. And let's take one example. I think advocating for religious freedom is really important. It's not Christian nationalism. It is a principled stance that you can defend from the Bible and from the Constitution. But if, when somebody asks you about religious freedom, you're willing to defend the right of the football coach to pray on the 50-yard line after the game, but you're not willing to defend the right of the Muslim to do the same, if you're willing to defend the right of churches to build churches, but not Muslims to build mosques, you're not actually advocating for religious freedom. You're advocating for Christian supremacy. You see, that's the difference there. If you are truly going to defend religious freedom, which, by the way, again, I think is a biblical doctrine, not just a constitutional doctrine, you have to defend the religious freedom of Muslims, of secular progressives, of atheists, and everybody else. And that's a good test case.
Yes, absolutely. So here's another quote. This one's from George Marsden. Paul D. Miller, a politically conservative, patriotic, old-style Republican, offers a thoughtful Christian critique of the most recent versions of Christian nationalism and its antecedents. Conservative Christians who suspect he may be wrong should at least give him a hearing. More progressive Christians can also learn from this balanced and constructive approach. So I really liked, that last part of it too. But why do you think that conservative Christians may suspect that you're wrong?
So there's a number of things that I've said here and that I say in the book that I know make some conservative Christians, they make it a little nervous. When I talk about separation of church and state, when I talk about the identity politics, when I say that preserving Christian social status isn't a legitimate part of our agenda, that just makes some Christians nervous. They actually they start to wonder, aren't we allowed to fight back? Aren't we allowed to advocate for our agenda? Aren't we allowed to advocate for what we believe in? Particularly when I say that there's one particular argument. Oftentimes conservative Christians believe that our Judeo-Christian heritage is the essential precondition for democracy, and that if we allow our culture to change too much, we will lose our experiment in free government. So they think that we actually do need to preserve our Christian cultural heritage as a kind of act of love for everyone, because that's what it means to preserve our democracy. Right? That, I think, is why some Christians on the right would oppose what I'm saying. My response there is, number one, yes, absolutely, we can defend what we believe in. I'm pro-life, I'm pro-religious freedom. That's not Christian nationalism. Just because I believe in those things because of my faith doesn't make it Christian nationalism. I also disagree with this idea that Christianity is necessary for democracy. And I base this belief on my study of the world. I've looked around the world, and there are dozens of examples of democracies in other cultures that are not Anglo-Protestant or even Western or European or Christian in any sense. 3 dozen by my count, outside in Africa and Asia. And then if you want to add in Latin America too, that's a lot more. Up to 60. It's in chapter 5, chapter 4 that I've made this argument, that there are examples of democracy in non-Western and non-Christian cultures all around the world. Therefore, we can relax a little bit. If American culture changes so that we're no longer predominantly Western or European or Christian, that really says nothing at all about the fate of democracy in America. We can keep being democratic even as our culture changes.
So I've read lots of good books that analyze an issue, or look at the history behind an issue. And those are all, very important things. But so often they seem to be lacking in answering the question, okay, what do we do about it? So do you have much to say about what do we do about it to resolve these issues?
Some, but I admit that my recommendations are maybe a little abstract. And once again, this goes back to the last chapter and my talk about the creed and the story. So my recommendation is cultivate an appreciation for the American story and the American creed, relax a little bit about cultural change, and recognize the difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of America. These are different things. I do end in the last few pages with a note to pastors. And this is maybe where I get a little bit more specific. I think pastors have more of a role to play here than many white pastors are comfortable with. Traditionally, African-American pastors don't have a problem with this because they've recognized since the civil rights movement, if not much earlier, that their churches are actually central to their social and cultural lives. And therefore, their pastors play a larger role in the shaping of their community's actions, political actions, and political beliefs. Many white pastors will talk about abortion. They'll talk about religious freedom. Maybe they'll talk about marriage. And that's where it stops for politics. Or they go to the opposite extreme and they become hyper-partisan and they say you just have to vote straight line Republican, right? There are a few of those out there too. So I don't think that the problem is a dial that we have to adjust where pastors should talk about politics more or less. It's rather the way we talk about politics. I think that pastors need to teach what it means to be a political animal, a social animal. We Americans are individualistic to our core, even to a fault. Individualism is actually not in the Bible. The Bible addresses itself to a people, a corporate entity. God saves us in a body called the church. Living together with others in a community, whether it's your family unit, your neighborhood, your church, your society, your nation, is always a corporate practice. And I think that we Americans are incompetent in the arts of living together. And I think that pastors should teach us. Every morning, every Sunday morning, they teach from the Bible about God, Christ, man response, right? They teach us the gospel. That's good. They should keep doing that. But in doing so, I think they need to spell out the implications for our corporate living at every layer, not just in the church, but in our family, not just in the family, but the neighborhood, the society, the nation, and so forth. And again, that might sound a bit abstract, but it just means in applying the Bible, applying the gospel to our lives, apply it to our social lives, apply it to our cultural lives, and yes, apply it to our political lives as well. And so that's how I end the book.
Interesting. So I know looking forward now, I know you mentioned a couple of books that are kind of on the horizon. You want to talk a little bit about those or any other projects that you've got that you can talk about at this point?
Yeah, I'm happy to report this book on Christian nationalism, I say in the preface, was just part one of a longer argument. And I kind of gesture towards two more books in a trilogy. And happy to share that InterVarsity's offered me the contract. So I'll be writing these two books over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years. The next book turns my attention leftward, where I'll offer my hopefully loving critique of the progressive left and the ways I think that it may be misleading or dangerous. And then volume 3 in this trilogy will be kind of the answer, right? It's a discussion of Christianity and political order. I think the answer is something like Christian democracy or Christian republicanism. Give me a few years to figure that out, and then I'll write that book and come back and we'll talk about that one.
Interesting. Wow. Well, you're tackling some tough subjects, which is, it's necessary. I mean, we've got to deal with these things. And we don't deal with them well as a country, as you said. So. Yeah,
I think that's fair, and I'm concerned about the state of our country, as so many of us are. We've been through worse. The Civil War was worse. I think even the 1960s were worse. And there's a lot of young people. Actually, there's a lot of people even my age that don't have the right perspective. They think that today is the worst it's ever been. But look, political violence was much worse in the 1960s and even or 1970s. The divisiveness that we see today is not actually new. I'm a bit concerned about how long this can go on without it deteriorating sharply. So there are some unique things about today. But the kingdom of God will persevere no matter what, even as we have our troubles here in America.
What's kind of disappointing to me is that, we had all those problems in the 60s, right? A lot of upheaval. But, it sounds like we're heading back there. We made a certain amount of progress since then that seems to be sliding away in some regard, at least.
That's an interesting story. And this is, takes us beyond the book here, but, I think the left today in the 2020s looks at the idealism of the 1960s left and concludes we didn't go far enough, right? And we need to take up the torch and push it further. Whereas the political right essentially looks to the 1980s and says we didn't go far enough in our conservative revolution, and we need to take that further. By the way, it's not really my argument. I'm drawing from Yuval Levin in his book The Fractured Republic, where he talks about how the generational nostalgias have infected our politics. And so in a sense, it feels like we're replaying the same arguments from decades past. And look, I think it didn't even start in the 60s. As I researched my book, I found that we have never agreed on the nature of the political projects in North America. When the Puritans came here, they were having debates in the 1640s about the nature of the Christian Commonwealth in Massachusetts between John Cotton and Roger Williams, and one of them exiled the other, right? So forever we've been disagreeing about the nature of our political project. I think the conversation will never quite end, but the freedom to have that conversation is essential to the American experiment.
Amen. Amen. Well, again, the name of the book is The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. You can learn more about Paul and all of his work at pauldavidmiller.com. And congratulations on doing this, pulling this off. It's an important topic. I think it's a must-read book. So really appreciate you doing it.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate the chance to share and talk. And best of luck for you with this podcast and all your other endeavors.
Thanks so much.
All right.